The Valerian Empire stretched across 3 entire galaxies, and everyone knew one thing for certain: you didn't say no to Emperor Corvin. His word was law. His psychic power could crush rebellions before they even started. But the mighty Emperor had a problem he couldn't solve with all his power, all his technology, all his armies. His son, Prince Demon, was 12 years old and completely untouchable. Not because of some force field or royal protocol. The boy physically couldn't handle being touched. The lightest brush of fingers against his skin would send him into violent seizures that shook the palace walls. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him scream. Normal lighting felt like knives in his eyes. For 12 years, the Empire's heir had lived in complete isolation, and nobody had any idea what to do about it. Rebecca Hayes didn't know any of this when they pulled her from her job managing Earth's agricultural stations. One day she was overseeing crop rotations on a peaceful colony world, and the next, armed Valerian soldiers were escorting her onto an Imperial transport ship. They called it a promotion. They said she was being honored with a position at the palace itself. But Rebecca had been around long enough to know when someone was lying to her face. The trip took 3 weeks through hyperspace, and nobody would answer her questions. The other servants on the transport avoided eye contact. When she tried to make conversation, they looked at her with something like pity. One older woman finally whispered to her in the meal hall, "May your death be quick." Then she hurried away before Rebecca could ask what she meant. The Imperial Palace was massive beyond comprehension. It floated in space above the Valerian homeworld, a structure so large it had its own weather systems inside. Rebecca was led through corridors of polished crystal that glowed with their own light, past rooms filled with courtiers whose skin shimmered with psychic energy. Everything was precise, clean, organized. And cold. So terribly cold, despite the perfect temperature. They brought her to a briefing room where a stern-faced official explained her duties. She would be caring for the Emperor's son. She would follow all protocols exactly. She would not deviate from approved methods. She would not question Valerian medical practices. If she succeeded, she would be rewarded. The official didn't mention what would happen if she failed, but he didn't need to. The number 48 kept appearing in the documents he showed her. She was the 48th person assigned to this position. Rebecca made herself ask the obvious question. What happened to the previous 47? The official's expression didn't change. They failed in their duties to the Empire. That's when Rebecca understood. This wasn't a promotion. This was an execution with extra steps. They gave her 1 day to review the medical files and previous reports. The more she read, the more horrified she became. Every single caregiver before her had tried to force the prince to adapt to Valerian standards. Bright lights to strengthen his tolerance. Loud sounds to build resilience. Forced physical contact to overcome his weakness. Each attempt had ended in disaster, seizures, injuries, and sometimes the caregiver being hurt when the prince's psychic abilities lashed out in panic. The Valorians genuinely believed they were helping. Their culture valued strength, control, discipline. To them, the prince's sensitivity was a flaw that needed correction. A weakness that brought shame to the imperial family. They couldn't understand that they were making everything worse. On her second day, they finally took her to meet Prince Demon. The guards opened massive doors to reveal a chamber the size of a warehouse. It was completely empty except for a small figure in the far corner. The walls were sterile white. Harsh blue lights blazed from the ceiling. The room hummed with the high-pitched whine of Valerian technology. And there, curled up against the wall, was a child. Just a child. His hands pressed hard against his ears. His body rocked back and forth in a steady rhythm. He was making a soft keening sound that broke Rebecca's heart. She'd seen this before. Not exactly this, but close enough. Her nephew back on Earth, before they'd figured out what he needed. Before they'd learned that different wasn't broken. The guards were watching her, waiting for her to approach the prince like all the others had. Waiting for her to fail so they could report back that another human had proven useless. Rebecca looked at that suffering child, then at the room designed to torture him, and made a decision that would either save her life or end it. She turned to the head guard and said, quietly but firmly, "I need to speak with the Emperor. Right now." They tried to refuse. She insisted. Finally, probably curious about what stupid thing this human would say before her inevitable execution, they arranged it. Emperor Corvin received her in a side chamber, his face carved from stone, radiating power that made the air itself feel heavy. Rebecca bowed as protocol demanded. Then she straightened and said the words that could mean her death. "Your Majesty, with all respect, you're torturing your son." The temperature in the room dropped. The guards reached for their weapons. But the Emperor held up one hand, and everyone froze. He stared at Rebecca for a long moment. "Explain yourself, human. Quickly." Rebecca took a deep breath and started explaining. She told the Emperor about neurodiversity, about how some brains process information differently. She explained that those bright lights probably felt like torture to his son. That the humming technology was like nails on a chalkboard. That forcing touch on someone whose nervous system experiences it as pain wasn't building strength, it was just cruelty dressed up as medicine. Emperor Corvin listened in silence. When she finished, he said something that surprised her. "You have 30 days. If my son improves, you live. If not." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Rebecca got to work immediately. First, she dimmed those horrible lights. The guards protested, but she'd been given authority, so they backed off. She tracked down the source of that high-pitched hum and had it disconnected. She brought in soft fabrics from the human quarters, things with gentle textures instead of the smooth, cold Valyrian materials. Prince Demon noticed the changes immediately. His rocking slowed down. The keening got quieter. But he still wouldn't look at her. Still wouldn't acknowledge her presence. So Rebecca did something radical. She sat down on the floor about 20 feet away from him and just existed. She didn't talk. Didn't try to approach. Didn't demand anything. She just sat there, giving him time and space to get used to her being in his world. The Valyrian court thought she'd lost her mind. The Emperor's advisors demanded meetings, insisting she was wasting precious time. "You're not doing anything," they complained. Rebecca just smiled and said, "Exactly." Days passed like this. Rebecca would come in, make the environment a little more comfortable, then sit quietly. Sometimes she'd hum softly, old Earth songs her mother used to sing. She noticed Demon would tilt his head slightly when she did this, listening. Other times she'd arrange objects in patterns, and she'd catch him watching from the corner of his eye. On day 9, something changed. Rebecca was humming a melody when she noticed Demon had turned his body slightly toward her. Not much. Maybe 15 degrees. But it was the first time he'd willingly oriented himself in her direction. She kept going. She started bringing in different textures for him to explore if he wanted, a weighted blanket, soft cloth, smooth stones. She never handed them to him directly. She'd just leave them within reach and back away. Slowly, carefully, he'd reach out and touch them when he thought she wasn't looking. The breakthrough came on day 17. Rebecca had learned that deep pressure seemed to calm him, while light touch sent him into panic. So she'd been working on making him a vest, something heavy that would provide constant, comfortable pressure on his torso. She'd stayed up 3 nights straight sewing it by hand, filling it with tiny weights she'd borrowed from the ship's cargo bay. She brought it in that morning and placed it on the floor between them. Then she sat down in her usual spot and started humming, a deep, resonant piece she remembered from a concert years ago. Something about the bass notes always felt calming in her chest. Demon stared at the vest for a long time. Then, moving so slowly it was almost painful to watch, he reached out and pulled it toward himself. He felt the weight. Squeezed it. Then, after another long pause, he put it on. The change was immediate. His shoulders dropped. His breathing evened out. He looked more present than Rebecca had ever seen him. She kept humming, barely daring to breathe. Then she did something she'd been building toward for over 2 weeks. She slowly extended her hand, palm up, and rested it on her knee. An invitation, not a demand. She didn't look directly at him. Didn't say anything. Just offered. Minutes passed. Maybe 10. Maybe 20. Time felt strange in that moment. Then Demon moved. Inch by inch, he shifted closer. His hand came up, trembling slightly. And then, so gently it barely registered, his fingertip touched her palm. Rebecca stayed absolutely still. The guards watching through the observation window held their breath. Demon's finger pressed a little firmer. Then his whole hand rested against hers. He was touching another person. For the first time in his entire life, he was experiencing touch that didn't hurt. Rebecca felt tears forming but blinked them back. "That's good," she whispered. "That's really good, Demon." He didn't pull away. News spread through the palace like wildfire. The human had done the impossible. The prince had allowed touch. Emperor Corvin himself came to see, watching through the window as his son and Rebecca sat together, hands connected. But success brought new problems. The emperor's brother, Lord Vexen, had been quietly building support to take over the throne. His argument was simple: Demon was too damaged to rule. A weak heir would destroy the empire. If Demon could be fixed, it proved he'd been broken all along, and broken princes shouldn't become emperors. Rebecca started hearing whispers in the hallways, seeing suspicious looks from courtiers. Someone even accidentally reset the lighting in Demon's room to full brightness one morning, sending him into a panic attack that took hours to calm. The message was clear. She hadn't just made one enemy. She'd made dozens. But she'd also made progress. And now that she understood how Demon's mind worked, she could start teaching him to navigate this hostile world on his own terms. She began developing a system of subtle hand signals so he could communicate without speaking. She showed him how to use his weighted vest and noise-dampening ear covers as tools, not shameful necessities. Most importantly, she started helping him see his differences as strengths. His ability to notice tiny details that others missed. His capacity to focus intensely on problems for hours. His heightened awareness of patterns in data and behavior. Demon began to blossom. The boy who couldn't be touched was learning to engage with the world in his own way. And the Empire, whether it was ready or not, was about to discover what that really meant. 3 months had passed since that first touch, and Prince Demon had made progress nobody thought possible. He could now walk through certain parts of the palace without panic. He communicated using the signal system Rebecca had taught him. He even attended short meetings with his father, wearing his weighted vest and ear protection like armor against the overwhelming world. But Lord Vexen wasn't giving up. If anything, Demon's improvement made him more dangerous. A prince who could function, even differently, was a threat to Vexen's plans for the throne. He needed to prove, publicly and dramatically, that Demon would always be too weak to rule. The Grand Celestial Festival was the perfect opportunity. Once every 5 years, all the noble houses of the Valyrian Empire gathered at the palace for a week of celebration. Thousands of people. Constant noise. Flashing lights. Psychic energy from hundreds of powerful minds pressing against each other. It was overwhelming even for typical Valorians. For Demon, it would be absolute torture. Emperor Corvin didn't want his son anywhere near the festival. But Vexen pushed hard, arguing in front of the full court that if Demon couldn't handle the Empire's most important celebration, how could he possibly handle ruling? Other nobles agreed. The pressure mounted. Rebecca fought against it. She pleaded with the Emperor to wait another year, to give Demon more time. But politics won out. Corvin finally agreed that Demon would make one appearance at the festival's opening ceremony. Just 15 minutes. Then he could leave. Rebecca spent weeks preparing Demon for those 15 minutes. They practiced in increasingly crowded rooms. She taught him breathing techniques. They developed exit signals so he could communicate if things got too overwhelming. She made sure he had all his tools, the vest, the ear protection, even special glasses to filter the harsh lights. The night before the festival, Rebecca couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong. She'd caught Vexen's guards whispering in hallways, going silent when she approached. Shipments had arrived at the palace that weren't on any official manifest. When she tried to ask about them, she was told it was classified security material for the festival. Her instincts were screaming warnings, but she had no proof of anything. Just a gnawing feeling in her gut. The festival opening was exactly as chaotic as she'd feared. The main ceremonial hall was packed with nobles in glittering formal wear. Lights flashed in rhythmic patterns. Music pounded through speakers. And underneath it all, that constant pressure of psychic energy, hundreds of powerful minds radiating their presence like heat. Demon stood beside his father on the raised platform, and Rebecca could see him struggling. His hands clenched and unclenched. His breathing was too fast. But he was holding on. Counting down the minutes until he could leave. Rebecca stood at the edge of the platform, watching everything. Watching Demon. Watching the crowd. And watching Lord Vexen, who stood across the hall with an expression that looked far too satisfied. 10 minutes passed. Demon was sweating but managing. 5 more minutes and they could get him out. That's when Rebecca noticed it. A group of Vexen's guards had positioned themselves at specific points around the hall. They weren't watching the crowd. They were watching Demon. And their hands kept moving to devices on their belts, devices she'd never seen before. Her blood went cold. She'd read about neural weapons in the security briefings. Devices that could overload sensitive nervous systems, causing seizures or worse. They were banned by imperial law, but that didn't mean they didn't exist. And if you wanted to make it look like a prince had simply broken down under pressure. Rebecca started moving toward Emperor Corvin to warn him. But before she could reach him, she saw one of the guards raise his hand to his belt device. The others mirrored the movement. They were about to activate. Rebecca opened her mouth to shout a warning. But Demon moved first. Later, Rebecca would realize what happened. Demon's heightened senses, which made normal life so difficult, had picked up on something nobody else noticed. The devices were charging, building electromagnetic fields. Most people couldn't sense it. But Demon could feel it like pressure building before a storm. He could hear the high-pitched whine of capacitors powering up. He could even smell the ozone they released. The boy who couldn't handle normal sensory input had just detected a threat that invisible to everyone else. Demon grabbed Rebecca's hand, something he only did when seriously distressed, and pulled her sharply to the left. At the same time, he made a gesture toward his father, one of their emergency signals. Danger. Now. Emperor Corvin had learned to trust his son's signals. He moved instantly, his psychic power flaring as he threw up a protective shield. The neural weapons fired a split second later. Invisible waves of energy pulsed through the hall, targeting the platform where the Imperial family stood. If they'd all been standing in their original positions, the weapons would have hit perfectly. But Demon had moved them just enough. The energy still caught the edge of the platform, and several guards collapsed immediately, their nervous systems overloaded. Alarms started blaring. The crowd panicked. But Demon wasn't done. While everyone else was reacting to what had already happened, his brain was already processing what came next. He could feel more devices charging. Could sense their locations by the electromagnetic signatures they gave off. He started pulling Rebecca through the crowd, pointing urgently. She didn't understand at first, then realized he was leading them to the attackers. His sensitivity to those electromagnetic fields was like a radar that nobody else possessed. Guards! Rebecca shouted. Follow us. He can sense them. Emperor Corvin caught on immediately. Protect my son and follow his lead. What should have been a massacre turned into a hunt. Demon moved through the chaos with surprising confidence, his sensory differences transformed into tactical advantage. He'd point, the guards would move, and they'd find another conspirator with another weapon. Within minutes, they'd captured 6 attackers. All of them wore Lord Vexen's colors. The last device was different, larger, more powerful. Demon could sense it was charging for something devastating. He led them to a service corridor where 2 of Vexen's senior guards stood with a device the size of a briefcase. When they saw they were caught, one of them triggered it anyway. The neural pulse was massive, strong enough to kill anyone with enhanced sensory sensitivity within 50 feet. But Rebecca had taught Demon something crucial over the past months. When things got overwhelming, he didn't have to fight through it alone. He could ask for help. Demon grabbed his father's arm and made a signal they'd practiced. Shield. Strong. Now. Corvin's psychic barrier snapped into place just as the weapon fired. The energy splashed against it like water against stone. Everyone survived. The investigation took less than a day. Lord Vexen had been sloppy in his desperation, and the trail of evidence led straight back to him. Neural weapons hidden in his private quarters. Encrypted communications with the conspirators. Even financial records showing payments to off-world arms dealers. He'd been so confident that Demon would break under the pressure of the festival that he hadn't bothered covering his tracks properly. The trial was public, as all matters of treason had to be. Vexen stood before the Imperial Court and did something that shocked everyone. He didn't deny the charges. Instead, he doubled down on his reasoning. Yes, I tried to remove the prince, he declared, his voice echoing through the judgment hall. And I would do it again. Look at him. He needs special equipment just to function. He can't handle normal light, normal sound, normal touch. His weakness cannot rule an empire. The court murmured in agreement. Even after everything, many nobles still saw Demon's differences as shameful defects. That's when Prince Demon did something nobody expected. He stood up from his seat beside his father and walked to the center of the hall. He was wearing his weighted vest and his ear protection, and he made no attempt to hide them. He stood there for a long moment, looking at Vexen, then at the assembled nobles. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. He spoke slowly, carefully choosing each word, another thing Rebecca had taught him. He didn't need to rush. Taking his time wasn't weakness. You're right, Demon said. I am different. I do need accommodations. I will never experience the world the way you do. He paused. But I saved all of you yesterday. Every single person in that hall would be dead if I hadn't sensed those weapons charging. My sensitivity, which you call weakness, is the only reason we're having this trial instead of planning mass funerals. The murmuring stopped. The nobles were listening now. I can track 1,000 ships through hyperspace at once because I notice patterns you miss. I prevented the Zorathian trade war because I saw economic ripples 3 weeks before your analysts did. I found corruption in the mining colonies because small details that you ignore practically scream at me. Demon looked directly at Vexen. You spent years trying to make me less sensitive. Rebecca taught me to be more effectively sensitive. That's the difference between you and her. Between old thinking and new. Emperor Corvin stood and placed a hand on his son's shoulder, firm, steady pressure, the kind Demon could handle. The prince speaks truth. And I have been a fool for not seeing it sooner. He turned to address the full court. How many others in our empire have gifts we've labeled as weaknesses? How many minds have we wasted because they didn't fit our narrow definitions? The sentence came down hard on Lord Vexen and his conspirators. But Corvin didn't stop there. He issued an imperial decree that changed everything. Prince Demon was formally confirmed as heir, with full authority. And Rebecca Hayes, the human who'd saved the prince's life, was appointed as the empire's first minister of neurodivergent affairs, with a mandate to reform how the Valorians treated anyone whose brain worked differently. Rebecca knew that title meant nothing without action. So she got to work. She started training programs across the empire. Not just for caregivers and teachers, but for everyone. She explained that brains develop differently, process information differently, experience reality differently. That accommodation wasn't coddling, it was basic logic. You wouldn't expect someone with no legs to climb stairs, so why expect someone with sensory processing differences to thrive in environments that hurt them? The pushback was immediate and fierce. Valyrian culture had spent centuries valuing uniformity and strength. Admitting that different approaches might be valid felt like surrendering their identity. Rebecca faced protests, threats, and dozens of formal complaints filed with the emperor. But she had something powerful on her side: results. A young woman named Lyra, who'd been locked away by her family for erratic behavior, turned out to have an incredible gift for languages when given the right support. She could now communicate with 17 different alien species and had become the Empire's chief diplomatic translator. A boy named Tav, who couldn't make eye contact and rarely spoke, revolutionized the Empire's computer systems. His ability to see code patterns that others missed made him the most valuable programmer in 3 galaxies. An older man named Kellys, who'd spent 40 years in isolation because crowds overwhelmed him, became the Empire's foremost expert on deep space navigation. In quiet environments where he could focus, his calculations were flawless. Story after story emerged. People who'd been hidden, dismissed, or actively harmed by the old system were now contributing in ways nobody had imagined. And it wasn't because Rebecca had fixed them. It was because she'd helped the Empire stop breaking them in the first place. Demon became central to this revolution. He started personal training sessions with other neurodivergent individuals, teaching them the techniques Rebecca had taught him. How to advocate for their needs. How to turn their differences into advantages. How to exist in a world that wasn't built for them without apologizing for who they were. 5 years passed. The Valyrian Empire was fundamentally different. Schools had censor-friendly rooms. Workplaces offered flexible accommodations. Public spaces provided quiet areas and adjustable lighting. The Empire's efficiency had actually increased because people were working in ways that suited their strengths instead of struggling against their neurology. Rebecca trained thousands of specialists who spread across Imperial space, bringing these new understandings to every colony and outpost. She wrote manuals, created assessment tools, and established support networks. The infrastructure of acceptance was growing, piece by piece. But the real change was cultural. A new generation of Valyrian children was growing up understanding that difference was normal. That needing help wasn't shameful. That there were many ways to be valuable, many ways to contribute, many ways to experience being alive. Prince Demon, now 17 and approaching his majority, had become a symbol of this transformation. He still needed his accommodations. Still processed the world intensely. Still moved through life differently than most. But he'd also become one of the most effective administrators in Imperial history, and his approval ratings were higher than any heir before him. When Emperor Corvin fell ill in Demon's 17th year, the succession was smooth. There were no plots, no conspiracies, no whispers of unfitness. The nobles who'd once questioned whether Demon could rule now competed to serve in his administration. The Empire was ready for something new. And the young prince, who'd once been too sensitive to even be touched, was ready to lead them there. The coronation ceremony was scheduled for the height of summer, when all 3 of the Valyrian homeworld suns aligned in the sky. Traditionally, it was a display of power and uniformity, thousands of nobles standing in perfect formation, rigid protocol followed to the letter, every moment choreographed to demonstrate imperial strength. Demon changed everything. The ceremony still happened in the Grand Hall, but the lighting had been modified with adjustable controls. Quiet rooms were available off the main chamber for anyone who needed a break. The music was beautiful but not overwhelming. And for the first time in imperial history, the coronation protocol included accommodations written directly into the ceremony itself. When Demon walked down the central aisle toward the throne, he wore his weighted vest under his ceremonial robes. His ear protection was decorated with imperial symbols, turned from medical necessity into a statement of pride. He moved at his own pace, steady and unhurried, and nobody rushed him. Rebecca watched from her position of honor near the throne, and she had to fight back tears. This was the same boy who, 6 years ago, had been curled in a corner, unable to tolerate even the presence of another person. Now he was walking calmly through a hall filled with thousands, ready to lead an empire. The High Chancellor began the traditional words of coronation, but when he reached the part where the new emperor was supposed to give their acceptance speech, Demon raised his hand. The Chancellor paused, looking uncertain. This wasn't in the protocol. Demon turned to face the assembled crowd. He took a moment to center himself, using the breathing techniques Rebecca had taught him years ago. Then he began to speak. "My father built an empire on strength through uniformity," he said, his voice amplified throughout the hall. He spoke slowly, pausing when he needed to, and nobody dared interrupt. Every citizen was expected to fit the same mold. Think the same way. Process information the same way. Experience reality the same way. Those who didn't were considered broken. He gestured to his ear protection, his vest. "I don't fit that mold. I never will." 4 years, that was treated as a flaw to be corrected. A weakness to be hidden. But a human woman showed me something different. She showed me that my brain isn't broken, it's just different. And different brings value that uniformity never could. Demon began walking slowly along the front row of nobles as he spoke. "In the past 6 years, we've discovered thousands of citizens whose gifts we were wasting. Artists who create beauty that moves souls but need quiet spaces to work. Engineers who solve problems nobody else can see but get overwhelmed in traditional offices. Warriors with lightning reflexes who struggle with parade formations. Every single one of them was being pushed to change who they were instead of being supported in becoming their best selves." He stopped and turned back to face the crowd. "I'm not going to promise I'll be the emperor my father was. I can't be. But I will promise this, I will build an empire where everyone, regardless of how their mind works, can contribute their gifts. Where accommodation isn't shameful. Where difference is valued. Where we measure our civilization not by how well people fit our expectations, but by how well we support every person in reaching their potential." The hall was absolutely silent. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone started a slow clap. Others joined. Within seconds, the entire hall was applauding, not the polite, required applause of formal ceremony, but genuine, thunderous approval. The coronation continued, and when the crown was placed on Demon's head, he became Emperor Demon Corvin I, ruler of 3 galaxies and architect of a new vision for what empire could mean. The changes started immediately. Demon's first official act was to establish the Imperial Neurodiversity Council, with representatives from every major colony world. Their job was to ensure that the reforms Rebecca had started continued and expanded. They would review laws, redesign public spaces, and make sure that accommodation was built into the Empire's infrastructure, not added as an afterthought. His second act was to reform the Imperial education system. Schools across the Empire would no longer have one standard way of teaching. Instead, they would offer multiple approaches, recognizing that children learn differently. Some needed movement while learning. Some needed absolute quiet. Some needed visual information while others preferred auditory. The goal wasn't to make every child learn the same way, it was to help every child learn in the way that worked for them. The military was next. Demon worked with his generals to restructure training and deployment. Soldiers weren't just bodies to be molded into identical units. They were individuals with different strengths. Some excelled at strategic planning but hated chaos. Others thrived in rapid response situations but struggled with repetitive tasks. The new military doctrine played to these strengths instead of fighting against them. Even the imperial court itself changed. The rigid protocols that had governed every interaction for centuries were relaxed. Meetings could happen in different formats. Some people preferred formal chambers, others did their best thinking while walking. Communication could be written, spoken, or signed. What mattered was the quality of ideas, not the performance of normalcy. Not everyone was happy with the changes. A conservative faction of nobles argued that the empire was losing its identity, becoming weak and scattered. They predicted chaos and collapse. But the opposite happened. Imperial efficiency increased by 30% in the first 2 years of Demon's reign. Innovation flourished. New technologies emerged from researchers who could finally work in environments that suited them. Diplomatic relations improved because the empire's negotiators included people who could read subtle cues that others missed. Even the military became more effective because units were composed of people working to their strengths. Other galactic powers watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Some dismissed the Valyrian reforms as foolish sentiment that would lead to weakness. Others, quietly, began implementing similar programs in their own territories. Rebecca, now in her early 50s, continued her work as Minister of Neurodivergent Affairs. She traveled across the empire, training new specialists, solving problems, and constantly refining the systems they'd built. She'd become one of the most recognized figures in imperial space, the human who'd changed everything. But her favorite moments were still the quiet ones. Once a month, Emperor Demon would summon her to his private chambers, not for official business, but just to talk. They'd sit in his censor-friendly office, with its soft lighting and comfortable silence, and discuss everything from policy to philosophy to memories of those early days when they'd first met. During one of these visits, about 8 years into Demon's reign, he did something that surprised her. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, that same gesture that had been such a breakthrough so many years ago. "I never thanked you properly," he said quietly. "Not just for helping me, but for seeing me. For understanding that I wasn't broken. That I was just me." Rebecca smiled, feeling tears prick her eyes. "You saved yourself, Demon. I just gave you the tools and the space to do it. You gave me more than that. You gave me permission to exist as I am. And in doing that, you gave an entire empire permission to stop pretending that difference is weakness." He squeezed her hand gently, firm pressure, the kind he could handle. "Humans figured this out long before we did. You learned that civilization isn't measured by uniformity, but by inclusion. That's your species' real strength. Not your technology or your armies. Your ability to see value in every form of consciousness." Rebecca had come to the Valyrian Empire as a prisoner facing execution for an impossible task. She was leaving, eventually, whenever she decided to retire, as the architect of a revolution. The empire that had once hidden its different thinkers in shame now celebrated them as essential. The culture that had valued rigid conformity now understood that diversity of thought was the real source of strength. And at the center of it all was Emperor Demon, living proof that different didn't mean less. That accommodation wasn't weakness. That the measure of a civilization was how it treated those who didn't fit the mold. The human Maid had calmed the Autistic Heir. And in doing so, she taught 3 galaxies what it really meant to be strong.